couple of weeks ago in the program, I told you about how the Israeli military has been brutalizing peaceful Palestinian protesters. So along the Israel-Gaza border, they've killed as many as 17 and injured up to 1,400 peaceful protesters. Now, this received little to no coverage in the mainstream media, with the exception of MSNBC's Chris Hayes, who did a surprisingly excellent job laying out the details in an actually objective way. As for Washington, though, lawmakers didn't really seem to mind the fact that Israel was brutalizing peaceful protesters, with the exception, of course, of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who called out the Israeli military's violation of Palestinian human rights. But aside from those few exceptions, pretty much the aggregate power establishment in the country, that includes the political establishment, the mainstream media establishment, they were silent. They had absolutely nothing to say. And when you look at government, certainly we maintain that we care about human rights. Specifically within Donald Trump's administration, UN Ambassador Nikki Haley has reiterated multiple times that the United States has and always will speak out in favor of human rights. We will condemn countries that are aggressive and violate human rights. In fact, this is what she said not too long ago.
The U.S. is always going to speak out on human rights. There are times we can work with countries, and there are times when we see human rights issues that we're going to call them out on it. But when they go against our values, we are going to say something. That's just who we are as a country. That's what we've always been great at.
So she's making it very clear here. Even if one of our allies, like Israel, decides to violate human rights, we're going to call them out. We're going to speak out against these human rights violations. So clearly, when she found out about the brutalization of peaceful Palestinian protesters, I mean, she spoke out immediately, right? Well, this is the response that UN Ambassador Nikki Haley had when she learned about what Israel's military is doing. Oh, that's right. All we have is crickets, because she actually hasn't said a damn thing about what Israel is doing, and her silence would be a problem in and of itself, but it goes much deeper in terms of how problematic her response has been, because as the UN ambassador, she's actually unilaterally blocking the UN Security Council from releasing a statement in support of Palestinians' right to demonstrate peacefully. And she's also blocking an independent investigation from occurring. And let me remind you that as ambassador to the UN for the United States, she is the one vote against it. It's her specifically. That's not only just refusing to speak out in favor of Palestinian rights, but she's blocking the UN Security Council from simply declaring that Palestinian protesters have the right to peacefully protest. Now, what was it again that she said about human rights?
The U.S. is always going to speak out on human rights. Always.
Well, I've got bad news for you, Nikki, because if you actually want to prove to the world that the United States really does care about human rights and that what you said wasn't just rhetoric, then you actually have to do meaningful things to demonstrate that you care about human rights, including the human rights of Palestinians. And condemnation of excessive force on behalf of Israel is certainly one way to do that, but she's a hypocrite. She claims that the United States cares about human rights and will always speak out on behalf of human rights, but she only does that when it's convenient for her. But she had the opportunity to right this wrong and actually send a message to the Palestinian protesters who have been killed and brutalized. And, of course, she decided not to take that opportunity to right this wrong.
We wonder why you're blocking an investigation into the Israeli use of excessive force in Gaza. The international community would like that investigation to go forward. You know, Israel deserves to be held accountable just like any other country.
The killing of peaceful protesters, including a journalist wearing a press vest in Gaza, and the UN is being blocked from investigating.
She's attending as a guest right now?
Well, we're all here as guests.
She's not attending as...
We're all guests.
So that was a video released by Code Pink, who asked her why it was the case that she was blocking an investigation or simply the declaration that Palestinians have the right to protest. And Medea, the person who was asking her the question there, she didn't even get halfway through her question. And Nikki just went back to playing on her phone. That's how much she cares about human rights. Look, here's the thing. American exceptionalism, it's delusion. We are not the good guys. We are the bad guys. We don't care about human rights. If Nikki Haley truly cared about human rights, then she would more forcefully condemn the genocide that's going on in Myanmar against the Rohingya. She would actually condemn the genocide that Saudi Arabia is committing with our weapons in Yemen currently. She would talk to Donald Trump about him befriending Duterte, the president of the Philippines, who is an actual criminal. Duterte is waging a war on his own people, and there are numerous extrajudicial killings that he's executed, and Trump befriended him. Nikki Haley hasn't said anything about that. And if Nikki Haley's so-called support for human rights was anything other than just political bluster, then she would have spoken out a long time ago against all of these things I just mentioned. She'd resign in protest when she learned that Donald Trump asked the CIA why they waited to bomb a house that had civilians in it. But Nikki Haley, like the rest of Donald Trump's administration and the broader government in the United States, is nothing more than a hypocrite. We only speak out in favor of human rights when it suits our geopolitical interests.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.